Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 5:30 and our forum's about to begin. And just by way of introduction, my name's Paul Bell. I'm a councillor in the Central Highlands Regional Council area, Rocky resident, born and bred here. And Ruthie and I left the Rocky area about 1979 to go to Emerald, so it's nice to be back here again. Well, I'm back here every week, but it's nice to be back here again, to be here with you all for the South Rockhampton Forum, Levee Forum this evening. So, welcome. It's good to have you all here. Tonight's an opportunity for us to hear more about where and the engineering and design phase of this project has gone, and some of the questions that people have been asking are being able to be looked at as a design sense. And I think this afternoon, tonight, we've got the opportunity to have a nice little question and answer session later on. By way of welcome, on behalf of the Rockhampton City Council, I would like to welcome you all here. It's great to have you all here this evening. It is a great venue and a nice opportunity, as I said, for us to have a conversation about the South Rocky flood project. I'd like to recognise the Mayor. It's good to have you with us again, Margaret. Margaret and I have certainly worked together on many platforms, continuing to push for this great part of Queensland, and have worked together for over many, many years in local government. To the other councillors, the Rocky City councillors that are here, some of those will be looking after you all later on with their microphones, but it's good to see my fellow councillors here as well. Our federal member, Michelle Andry. Michelle, it's great to have you here. I was only in Canberra about 3 weeks ago, catching up with Michelle and Kenny O'Dowd and others, again promoting this great region. So it's nice to see you back here, Michelle, and certainly great to have you here with us this evening. Look, there's just a couple of little things we need to sort of keep, I think, in mind. Bathrooms are out either side, I think, through the exits. In regards to safety, if there is any those fire noises, the whoop whoop ones and whatever else, we go through the same places, through the exits. This evening I think we'll be able to have an opportunity though to sit around the auditorium and have a great discussion. But to start that discussion, let's have an opportunity, I think, to listen to Ethel Hatfield from...
Ethel Speedy. Sorry.
Ethel Speedy.
Yes.
Ethel Speedy.
Not Hatfield.
Not Hatfield. Ethel Speedy from the Darumble people, and Auntie Ethel is going to do a welcome to country. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Mayimbagu Dumbledon Bimbi Naraga Inda Davu Yirigu Yinam Galagangari. My name's Ethel Speedy, not Ethel Hatfield. That's my younger sister. She's a Hatfield.
You're better looking too, though.
Oh, thank you. That may be because with age you mature and look better. Yeah. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders, my ancestors who passed on, and I would like to acknowledge your elders and your ancestors that are present here today. And I just wanted to let you know, as a kid I grew up along the Fitzroy River because I lived at Yamba for a lot of years. I started school in a little country place called Millman out there, and used to con my mother up every Sunday to go down and have a swim in the river. But we had to do our housework before we done that. Now, I've seen the changes in the river over the years because I grew up got married and lived out there at Yamba again. When they put the barrage, is it the barrage? When they put the barrage up there. But before, when I was young, we used to swim there all day, and to the point where our skin was nearly white and wrinkled, you know, because and our eyes were as red as, because we swam in the river. And you could throw a white pebble about 3 or 4 metres, and we used to dive down and get the white pebble, pick the white pebble up and bring it up to the surface. You know, as kids, we could dive deep and we could do these things. Once they put the barrage up, that didn't happen. That, for the simple reason the river got really dirty, and it just backed up, and it was really a big change, and I wasn't really impressed at it, but, you know, there was a purpose for that barrage. And I know that this session here this evening is about the flood levee. And this is a serious matter, because when you change the system of the river, you change the whole environment around it. So, and I'm sorry, but I'm 71 years of age, and I've lived on the river, and I've seen the changes. And I pray to my great Creator that the decision you make about the flood levee will be for the better for everyone around. I've lived here through the cyclones, through the floods, and I've seen what's happened. And I must apologise, I did not acknowledge our Mayor, Margaret Strelo, and our federal member. I'm very sorry for that, but I just wanted to let you know about my story. As an Indigenous person, our spirit is within the river. It's within the environment around it, you know. And you know what? You're most welcome. I know that a lot of you would have lived around this area most of your lives. Some may have just moved here, but others have lived here most of their lives. But the Darumba people have walked along that Fitzroy River for thousands of years, not just 200, thousands. So, I think I've said enough. And if I said the wrong thing, I don't give permission for you to shoot me. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel, for those wise words and that wonderful welcome to country. Look, just a couple of little things that might be going on in the first 5 or 10 minutes. Media are going to be here, maybe taking some little back shots from up the back. There might be some both print and TV media moving around, but I think as per the rules of the House, that will just be for around that first 10 minutes. There will be other media here during the forum, but as I said, the vision will be short-lived, and the people from the TV area might be here for about those first 10 minutes. The only other thing I've got to say now was that we're in for 2 lovely welcomes, one from Michelle Landry, our local member, and then followed by Margaret Strelo, our Mayor. Could I please welcome Michelle Landry just to give us her welcome, please.
Thanks very much, Paul. And I too would like to acknowledge Mayor Margaret Strelo and the Rocky Regional Councillors here today, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I don't want to say too much because the forum is about letting you hear from the experts and asking your questions. I would like to thank Rockhampton Regional Council for holding the forum and understanding that there are a lot of concerns. Flood mitigation is important for everyone. We want our region to prosper and not be hamstrung by the negativity and impacts of flooding. However, it is important that in finding a solution, we don't create additional headaches and heartache for others. So tonight, I urge everyone to listen to the answers with an open mind. We have listened to your concerns and asked the engineers to explain the answers, so I do hope that we can share the courtesy. As always, please feel free to contact my office if you wish to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. And now, without further ado, I'll just ask our Mayor Strelo to come and to do a brief welcome. Thank you, Mo.
Thank you, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Acknowledge Michelle Landry, acknowledge the councillors. Most importantly, I acknowledge those in our community who have come to hear firsthand the detail of this extraordinary piece of engineering that we plan to build. You won't hear anything new. The studies were completed a few years ago and the reports have been on our website in one form or another and in the public domain for a long time. But hopefully this evening is an opportunity to hear in one sitting from the experts directly with hopefully good visuals and explanations to join the dots of the project. This is our once-in-a-generation opportunity. What we are asking of the federal government, what has been committed by the state government, what has been contributed and committed by local government adds up to $60 million. Now, we've also got a commitment from the federal opposition, but they're not in government, so we really do need support from our federal member. The proposed $25 million that we are asking from the federal government is about what is usually allocated every year for the whole of Australia for flood mitigation. So it is a huge ask, and the fact that it wasn't shut down straight away by the Prime Minister or by Barnaby Joyce gives us an extraordinary opportunity that won't come again. The Levee studies have been detailed and thorough. It is an ambitious project, but oddly, it's actually a very logical levee to build. It is able to accommodate a detention basin and 3 separate pump stations, a luxury that many levees just don't have. We have the room to do this and to do it well. This levee is a landmark proposal which will change the future of our city if we have the courage to grab hold of it. 13% of our urban mass, so that's basically the boundaries of the old Rocky City, 13% floods. Between the North Rockhampton levee already done, the next 100 houses in the North Rockhampton, so that'll be 500 out of North Rockhampton. This proposal here that we're discussing this evening, and some other bits and pieces of fill and valves and whatever that we know we can do, each one that picks up a few here and a few there, we can address about 70% of the properties that flood in this city. Hopefully by the time the experts have finished, you'll understand it's not an arbitrary thing. We didn't kind of go, and I think the use of the temporary levee confused people a little. They thought we just picked somewhere to put it. There's a whole lot of science around it. I wish we could protect every property. So there is science, there is hydrology. You'll have a much better understanding of that by the end of today. Some of you here have come with your minds made up, and there is nothing that we can say that will change your mind today. I'm just wondering if I could have a show of hands, the people who are in that category. Okay. Can I ask you, please, to just to listen and respect that there are other people here, and I thank you, there were so few of you. So if you can respect that others who are here this evening are here too, and their mind is still open, and they are keen to hear what the experts have got to say. I thank you for your openness. I commend this work to you, and I really look forward to watching for myself as the whole project gets put together in one sitting. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Margaret. So we just, I suppose, the forum proper will be a little bit of an opportunity for you to hear from 2 or 3 groups of speakers, and that will be a little opportunity to hear about the history and background, which will be from our council engineer Peter Coford, and then followed by the AECOM team who are here. And then Peter will just give us a little bit of a finish off and in regards to funding, next steps and others. We then want to have about 30 minutes of questions, so it's your time then and turn then to ask questions. So we really would hope that you are able to focus your questions on the presentation, on the forum, and I think, just if you have other ideas and other options and other things that are away from the forum and the intent of what's being presented tonight, there's lots of opportunities for you to be able to present those either to the council, to AECOM and others. In your packs you'll see websites, contacts and other arrangements you can make to directly provide those alternatives or other options directly to any of the team from RCC or from AECOM. So that's a little bit about how we think the forum will move forward this evening. Here it is, it's all up there, and that's a bit about and how we should move forward. Our forward presenters this evening are, of course, Peter Coford. Peter, if you'd like to stand, just really quickly. Peter's Regional Services, RCC. Peter's been in local government, civil engineering, etc., about 20 years. And Peter's very experienced executive manager in local government, and currently has that regional manager, regional services at Rocky City Council. So this is very much his baby. From the AECOM team, Ben McMaster. Ben, if you'd like to stand or put your hand up. Yeah, Ben's a local boy. I know his mum well. She works, I also chair the board of the HHS, the Rocky Hospital Board, and his mum works up there, and she's a very strong part of our team. So I hear all about her, Ben, and tonight we'll hear more from Ben. Ben's the principal engineer with extensive experience, certainly in hydrology, hydraulics and flood risks. Does a lot of work in that area, and has been, I think, one of the principals in both the Emerald Levee feasibility study, which I know a lot about, and also with the other South Rockhampton flood levee project as well. The other members of Ben's team are Brian Wright, who's the Industry Director for Water for AECOM. I've met Brian in lots of places, and Brian is the engineer with, I think he's got the most seniority from the AECOM team, about 37 years experience in water and civil, so extensive experience there. And he has led and participated in various studies, particularly in urban areas, design projects on floodplains, right throughout regional Queensland. It's nice to have you here, Brian. And Robert Burke. So Robert is he's a geotechnical guy, and he's their lead for Northern Territory and North Queensland for AECOM. Geotecho guys are really important when it comes to tying these things into the ground and how they will work, and how the system itself operates if you have a levee. He's certainly the AECOM's practice leader, 20 years experience, and he's managed many geotechnical analytics and design for lots of levees around, including the South Rockhampton levee and also the Emerald levee as well. So look, that's our panel. They'll be there for your questions as well when question time comes. But firstly, I'd just like to, Peter, ask you, would you like to take the microphone and lead us through the project history? Please welcome Peter.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be able to have the opportunity to run through such a comprehensive project and make sure everyone can understand where we're up to and what we think we can achieve by this project being implemented. The first part of my presentation is about the history of developing an understanding of the Fitzroy River. It's obviously a massive river, very complex, and it's been studied over many years. I'm also going to talk about what has been done over the years to reduce flood risks in that catchment and in Rockhampton specifically. And the last part is about how do you go forward managing flood risks in Rockhampton. You go backward. Okay, this slide is just to show you the amount of studies that have been done on this catchment. Most people in this room would know there were some major floods in 1911, and there was a number of floods that kept occurring, but it wasn't until the 1960s when actually flood modelling started to occur on this catchment. Typically, each of those studies you looked up there, it was prompted by another flood, and people said we've got to do something about it and we've got to understand the river better, and we need to address the flood risks in our community. The most significant one, where really it was all wrapped up in one review of history, was 1992. So the next slide, please. In 1992, there was a major flood event in 1991 that prompted this study of 1992. It was done by the Water Resources Commission of Queensland, and as you can see, it was funded by the federal government. It was undertaken over 18 months, one of the most major studies ever done on the catchment. It detailed and reviewed all the options to mitigate risk for Rockhampton. And you'll see there's things called structural and non-structural, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. And it was the most detailed risk assessment that had occurred to date. So, what that study identified is some key things. It had two priority areas. The first highest priorities were the Yeppen Crossing. The second was the South Rocky Flood Levee. The third was the Airport Levee, and then there was the Splitters Creek Levee and North Rockhampton. The study in 1992 looked at various dams, weirs. It looked at diverting floodways, dredging the river, a buyback scheme for the properties that were affected, and also raising the Pink Lily breakout. And what's important is this is the first map that actually displayed the flood mitigation scheme. So this is back in 1992. And you'll see on the right-hand side there, they're both labelled Priority 1. One is the Yeppen Crossing, and the second is the South Rockhampton Flood Levee. The Priority 2 and 3 areas was the Airport and the Splitters Creek, and North Rockhampton was 4. So some 25 years ago, it was first presented as the option. If you go to the next slide, this just shows that levee, and that was the layout proposed back in 1992. And you'll see later on how that's been revisited and refined over time. So that was 1992, and as you would have saw on those slides earlier, there's been many other studies, and it got to a point where the council then basically got and said we're going to develop its own floodplain management strategy, and that's what this document on the screen is. The strategy, when adopted, actually set the same priorities. So it was still Yeppen Crossing, North Rockhampton was jumped up, and I'll explain why, and the South Rockhampton levee was still up there at the top. So this shows the phases very clear. We were fortunate enough to have the Yeppen crossing completed. There was an opportunity for funding that brought forward the North Rockhampton flood mitigation scheme. As we've said previously, the South Rockhampton flood levee has been fully designed. There was some initial high-level feasibility work done on the airport, Splitters Creek, and there are other ongoing projects across the city that we are studying right now. Okay. Flooding's about not solving it, it's about managing the risk. Right around Australia, communities are built on floodplains, typically beside rivers, because it was a very logical and practical thing to do for a whole range of reasons. Part of flood mitigation is about minimising and reducing risks. And there's 3 risks that we deal with in flood mitigation. I'll jump to the bottom one. Residual risk is something Rockhampton does very well. That's the risk that you can never remove. It is just not feasible. And the only way to manage that is through disaster management and having a community aware of its flood risk and being prepared. The future risk, Rockhampton's done a lot of work in this area. It's about flood policy, it's about planning rules, it's about making sure you don't put any more people within the floodplain and at risk. The last component is existing risk, and really this is what the South Rockhampton flood levee is about. It's about the existing buildings and the development that's in the floodplain at risk, and the only way to solve it is through a structural measure. And this is just another way of looking at it. So land use planning and flood policy keeps people away from the water. Structural, which is like the levee, is keeping water away from the people. Those other areas which I talked about before, which is development and planning, which is reducing risks for people who live in homes. It's about setting floor levels and giving freeboard. It's about keeping them away from those high velocity areas. And the last, as I said, is about disaster management. Okay. Okay. So where are we at the moment? Council made a commitment in 2013 to investigate the levees. It set money aside in its budget. It sought funding from federal and state government and was successful in achieving that. As it says there, 1.45 million has been spent on the feasibility and design of the South Rockhampton levee. 416,000 has been provided by each state and federal. The study was completed in 21 months. And here shows the phases. So the initial phase is about modelling, and it's effectively understanding the flows, the depths, and how the floodplain behaves. It looks at the options, and you'll see some more of that in the presentation. Phase 2 was preliminary design, and as it says there, in October 2014, the final design was prepared. That included detailed drawings of the proposal, the alignment, and also had prepared estimates and had done a review of environmental considerations. So they are just a snapshot of the investigations that were undertaken as part of that project. So right at the top you'll see drainage and hydraulics, the most fundamental. That's what we need to understand before we can move forward. Then we talk about environmental heritage, geotechnical analysis, civil design, visual amenity, the impact on services, transport, and ultimately then a cost estimate and economic evaluation. Back then, the project objectives were to develop a levee system which will protect low-lying areas of Rockhampton occupied by homes, businesses, schools, parks and infrastructure from major flood events. Not all events, but major flood events to a certain level. Improve the flood immunity of the Bruce Highway, the Lower Dawson, Gladstone Road, which back then was still also looking for that construction of the Yeppen Crossing. The other objective was to minimise adverse impacts of the levee, visual, amenity, hydraulics, environmental impacts on our existing infrastructure and minimise resumptions for that corridor. I'm now going to hand over to Ben, who's going to run through the technical presentation that's been undertaken by AECOM. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, firstly, just I'd like to thank everyone for coming along tonight. It's not very often we get a big crowd like this in front of engineers to explain what we've been doing for the last few years, but really appreciate everyone's time to come along and listen to us. We've already had the introductions, but I'm joined by Brian and Rob, so we'll both do a bit of handing over just to cover the technical aspects of the project. So I might just start with our role. So a lot of people ask who are AECOM. So we've operated an office here in Rockhampton for about 17 years. We have 30 local staff, but we're a much bigger beast than that, I guess, if you're looking at a global perspective. So you can see the graphic there. We're in a lot of countries, we have a lot of staff, and we do this kind of work fairly regularly with flood mitigation projects. So that's just a few examples. This is some work that we have been doing, international sort of projects, but also some projects locally as well. One on the left is actually a major flood pumping station and floodgate. Got a big gate up in the top there as well, swing gate, and then we've got some earth levees there as well, so it just gives a snapshot. So in terms of our role, so we were engaged by council, and ultimately we were there to assess the technical feasibility of the South Rocky Flood Levee project. Our role is to provide independent advice and technical analysis. We're not here to say whether the levee should proceed or not. We're here to give all the information for ultimately you to make that decision. There's a lot of guidelines and technical standards that surround levees. Levees are a major sort of infrastructure projects, and so we have to align to those as engineers. We also have obtained inputs from a range of stakeholders throughout the design process, and overall there's 3 of us here, but we're going to be talking for about 100 technical specialists from AECOM who have been involved on this project, both in Australia and the US. So I'll just quickly step through a few key definitions, because we will talk about this throughout tonight and probably in the Q&A as well. Levee, I've got a little definition there, but I will have a slide shortly just to explain that. Most people, I'm pretty sure, are aware of what a levee is. We will talk about average annual damage, and so that's the cost, the long-term annual cost to the community and the economy due to flood damage. And so when we do economic evaluations of levees, that's something that we look at. We look at what was the damage before annually and what is it afterwards, so that we can see how that levee performs. Afflux is another key term that's used fairly regularly. Some will be aware of that, but afflux is basically where we put an obstruction in a flow path. We have an increase in water level upstream of that obstruction, normally a decrease in flood levels downstream. So when we're talking about afflux, that's what we're referring to. Benefit cost ratio is another one which will also be discussed tonight. So basically that's a ratio between economic benefits of a project and costs. So when the BCR is above 1, that's normally an indication that it's worth considering for funding and for implementation. Lastly, and probably the key one which I'll cover, is annual exceedance probability. Now, when we come to do risk assessments and flood studies and studies of major river systems, and as engineers, we always talk about annual exceedance probability. So that's the chance that you would have a flood at equal to or greater than that in a given year. So some people would have heard the Q100 or the 100-year ARI flood. That's used fairly regularly. We won't be saying that tonight. It's a terminology that can be misunderstood by the community, and some people think if you've had a 1 in a 100-year flood, you won't have that for another 100 years. That's just not the case. Statistically, what we'd prefer to say is you've got a 1% chance of that happening each year. Emerald's a good example. So Emerald had a major flood in 2008, which was a 1 in 70 year flood, and then they followed that in 2 years later and had a 1 in 130 year flood. So they've had 2 major floods within 2 years of each other. Statistically, that's just how it goes. So in terms of levees as a flood mitigation option, as Peter mentioned, there's a range of different options, and levees aren't always the answer. Levees are used in particular circumstances where it warrants them. But if a levee is a potential option, then what we're normally looking at is raised predominantly earth embankments. However, there are other types of levees which I'll go through as well. Just in terms of how they get used around the world, so there's about 48,000 kilometres in the US that the US Army Corps knows about. They expect that there's another 150,000 kilometres that they don't have documented, and that's across almost 12,000 different systems. So the statistics are pretty mind-boggling. You've got 2/3 of the US population is behind a levee over there, so it's frequently used. There's several 100,000 kilometres then when you sum that up with the US and Europe, and even in Australia we've got several thousand kilometres used in Australia. So they are used around the place. So just some examples. I thought it's worthwhile just doing a quick snapshot. These aren't all the levees, but these are some key ones. This is in Rocky. This is in our backyard. So this is the Dowling Street Levee, Kershaw Gardens, for those familiar with that area. So it's an 800 metre long crib wall system. So that particular levee was put in place in 2016, protects about 20 homes. You can see on the left, that was before construction, on the right, after construction. And this was it during the flood that we've just had. So it's a bit hard to see, but that's the levee running around here. I'm sure everyone knows about this, or those locals familiar with the area. So this is our North Rocky Flood Mitigation Scheme, stage 1 of the scheme. Now, there's a bit of background to this project in terms of planning, but the works for this project isn't just the barrier. That's what people saw, but prior to this there was a significant amount of backflow prevention works done on the stormwater outletting to Lakes Creek Road, and also a significant amount of works to the sewer system to prevent ingress of floodwater back through the sewer. What went hand in hand with this is then a temporary flood barrier, which was about 380 metres long, that was rolled out on Ellis and Rodborough Street. And we had a number of temporary pump stations set up as well at key points to collect any minor seepage that occurred and pump that back over. So I know a lot of people would have seen those out and about with the trucks pumping some of those flows back over. So that's, you can see the system set up, and then bottom left during the flood. Probably the better ones are actually these. So these are the actual aerial imageries showing what actually occurred during the peak of the flood we've had this year. So probably this one here. So for those not aware, the Lakes Creek Road is actually a high point all the way along, and we do that system in itself performed as a levee. So the road and rail there are higher than the flood height, all the way up to a 1% annual exceedance probability. So it's quite a high level of flood protection offered by Lakes Creek Road. The issue we've had previously is that the river's gone through the stormwater pipes, backed up into the area in behind Lakes Creek Road and flooded those properties. And it's also come back up around the creek and inundated back through that way as well. This is a backwater area of the floodplain, and with those backflow prevention devices on the road, and with the barrier, which you can see in a few of the shots there, we can actually, particularly this one, that's where the river came up around the creek, and we cut it off by the barrier and protected the homes in here. So there's about 400 properties protected with this stage 1 of the scheme. And stage 2 of the scheme is to ultimately move that barrier further down and protect more properties and move it down to Water Street. But Water Street requires reconstruction in order to achieve that. So that's a future stage of the scheme. And all the neighbours up in Mackay. So Mackay's had a flood levee system since the 1970s on the Pioneer River. It's a mixed type system, so they have earth levees, they have vertical flood walls, they have crib walls, very, very similar actually to the South Rocky flood levee proposed here. Longer than ours, 13 kilometres, and across 7 different levee systems you can see on both sides of the Pioneer River. So that system's been in since the 1970s. It's protected Mackay on numerous occasions, 2008, 2010, and even in some of the recent flooding we've had this year. Charleville, most people are probably aware of this one as well. So completed in 2009, upgraded slightly in 2013. It's protected against 3 flood events since construction. Again, it's a combination, so you've got some earth levee components, we've got gate crossings across the road like we'll have here, and some temporary barrier as well, and some vertical walls. So that's another example of a flood levee system used in rural Queensland, $20 million cost. And after that one, Suncorp have done some assessments, so average insurance premiums, $990 a year down to $400 after the levee was completed. And it's actually paid for itself already after, about 8 years. So you can go to the Hunter Valley. The Hunter Valley scheme is enormous. So it's got 160 kilometres of flood levee in the Hunter. There's 5 basins, 3 spillway overflow points, and basically it was the flooding that occurred in 1955 which really spurred the council, the state government, the feds to implement this scheme. But it's mind-boggling, 160 kilometres of levee, and it's protected a number of the townships there in 1971, 1977, 2007. So it's been there for a long time. Alceston, so down in Tasmania. Again, this is another good example of a scheme that was completed earlier, quite some time ago, and was starting to become structurally deficient due to old standards and codes and ongoing issues with not maintaining some components. So they've got in there and they've actually reconstructed the scheme. So it's a 12-kilometre levee system completed in 2015, so only recently. And that's a $60 million project which protected in the 2016 event, which was quite a significant flood event down there. I'll get in front of everyone who's going to ask the question about Lismore. So we'll put the record straight with Lismore because the media did a pretty poor job, to be honest, around explaining what happened in Lismore. The Lismore flood levee system was completed in 2005. So it's protected the CBD of Lismore in 2005, 2007, 2009. The cost of those 3 events alone has already paid for itself plus almost again with the levee system. So it's a 3 kilometre long levee system, and it was $20 million. And as all you probably know, it overtopped in 2017. So that particular levee system was designed for a 10% annual exceedance probability. So 10% every year you'd have a chance you'd get a flood greater than the levee system. So it was a fairly low level of immunity offered by the levee. It was what was affordable at the time. And I've just included up here at the top right, that's actually the original design, and showing that there were 2 spillway points to allow flow into town when there was an event larger than the levee was designed for. And the photo on the bottom right is exactly what occurred, and you can even see on their gauge, they talk about with the community when it reaches a certain gauge height when levee overtopping will start to commence. The levee did not fail, it did not breach, it did not give way, it simply overtopped, which it was designed to do in events larger than what it was designed for. In terms of design criteria and standards, there's a number of relevant design guidelines and standards. The one on the far left is really good news for the engineering industry. The Queensland State Government is now regulating levee banks and has been for a couple of years now. It was something that was much needed to make sure that levees are designed to the right codes and requirements. So there's now a requirement for a council, as in this case, to actually make application under the new levee regulations, and there's specific guidelines and requirements that levees have to meet in order to achieve approval under those regulations. The Queensland Levee Guidelines make significant reference to the International Levee Handbook. That's been the work over 5 or 6 years from the international levee community across multiple governments to basically pull together the international best practice when it comes to levees and put that in one big guideline. And that's the particular guideline that's been adopted for the South Rocky Flood Levee planning and design. So probably just moving through the alignment, because that's probably the very first place to start. First question that we always ask is, well, what are we trying to protect with this levee system? So just to help everyone, North Arrow is just here, so north this way. And so the first question is, we've got obviously Lower Dawson Road. Everyone's aware that Yeppen North and South have now been upgraded to provide immunity of the Bruce Highway into town, but then diverting to Upper Dawson Road. So Lower Dawson Road is a particular focus to try and protect that. There's also a number of businesses shown in orange, park, schools and infrastructure in blue, and then residential areas. So this was the original alignment put forward in 1992, which Peter showed a bit of a map out of the study back then. And that's where we started with the study. First, as we worked through this, there's a number of things that probably pop up for most people. It did encompass the key infrastructure and the residential area and commercial buildings. This is a key flow path, and I'll go through this in a bit more, but this is the roundabout, and this is going out through the Yeppen crossing and coming into town. The flow through this throat here, through Yeppen North as we call it, is significant, and it's a very important flow path for the western floodplain. The implications of the levee here causes the majority of the effects back upstream through the western floodplain and back to the airport. And so the alignment here, the choice of the alignment needs to be made very, very carefully. So that was a key issue with the old 92 alignment, is it jutted out a bit, and that wasn't going to be good from a hydraulics perspective. At the time, probably unknown back then, but now we do know that it crossed right through the middle of a wetland here, and not just any wetland. That's one of national significance. It's a key wetland for the region, and it also has significant cultural heritage value to the Durrumbal people, and so that was a key issue with the original 1992 alignment crossing through there. And we also had some interference with some fairly major overhead transmission lines coming into Rockhampton at Powerlink own. So the study commenced with us looking at alignment options, and so we generated a number of options which you can see there, different pros and cons as always with this kind of infrastructure, some people being left out, some people being left in, and obviously different costs as well associated with those different levee alignments. The process then becomes a fairly rigorous one over about 5 or 6 months. So what we looked at is, on a number of different disciplines across our technical teams, what are the pros and cons of each of those alignments? And then we basically run through a process of scoring and workshopping. So we had a number of workshops with key stakeholders. So we're talking state government inputs through a number of those, and basically trying to arrive at what was the best balance with the selected levee alignment. It's always a balancing act with any of this kind of infrastructure. What that left us was the selected alignment, which you can see there. So you'll notice that we changed the alignment fairly significantly around the Hastings site. We've pulled it in, tucked it in quite significantly, and also incorporated some fairly important bends in the levee there to take the flow and divert it smoothly around that end of the levee. We've moved well away from that wetland and onto the Fitters Street area. And similarly, we've pushed right over to Rosehill Park and got around the back of the treatment plant before coming down the main strip down Key Street. So one of the key questions we get asked is, what does it look like? So I've tried to use some photos here just to give an indication of what the system looks like in the different areas, but we will show some maps later on which shows that in a bit more detail. So this particular location, that's Walter Reed. Most people are familiar with that landmark. So around the Walter Reed Centre, particularly when we're getting closer up Key Street past Derby Street, we're looking at a full demountable stop log system, which is the bottom system you can see there. Reason being is we don't want any levee shown along the riverbank there. It's a key location for the community, and the visual impacts of a levee along there would be fairly horrendous. So that particular system involves a footing that would be permanently there, and then before flood events, the stop log system would be erected when the first warning of flooding came. Further down, we also past Walter Reed, we start to use a composite wall system. So there's an example of that there, where we have a small permanent wall levee, which can then be have the panel system incorporated on top, just to give that extra height that we require along that section of the riverbank. So as we move further down the river, particularly out past the boat ramp and further down, we start to convert to a crib wall system. So crib wall system is the same system used at Dowling Street at Kershaw Gardens. So again, it's somewhere you could go and have a look at what it looks like, but that's the image there, the top right, out at Kershaw Gardens. And that's the system that will be used due to space constraints. It starts getting tight around that particular area down past the boat ramp, so we're using that from a space perspective. When we do get then into the rural areas where we've got more space, we adopt the earth levee. And so it's fairly sort of stock standard. We'll talk a bit more detail around the specifics and the material properties and what's required, but we go an earth levee with, and in this case we're adopting a vinyl sheet pile on the top. The intent of the vinyl sheet pile is purely just to provide the freeboard, and again I'll touch on freeboard and what that means shortly. But for the most part it's the earth embankment, grassed, and in some locations rock protected where we need to from velocities. We do have a number of gates where we're crossing existing roads, and we also cross the North Coast rail line and require a gate structure there as well. Gates across roads and rails are done all the time in levee systems. They're nothing new. In this particular case you can see a number of examples there, both Australia, Europe, US. They're done fairly frequently. So ultimately it's about bringing the levee and terminating on either side of the road or rail, and again putting demountable barrier in before the flood event arrives to actually close that opening up. But in normal situations, the levee will terminate either side of the road and rail and continue onwards. Pump stations. So we do have a few pump stations, obviously. We'll talk again about those in a bit more detail. Top one's there, just showing an exterior and interior of a pump station we've designed recently. That's a much bigger pump station, just to put that in perspective. So we're talking there a 30 cubic metre a second pump station, so 30,000 litres a second. So again, we'll put that in context as we go through, but that is a much bigger pump station. Obvious intent of the pump station is to collect stormwater. If we do have a river flood occurring at the same time, so collecting that stormwater from the local runoff and rainfall and pumping that over the levee. It's a frequently used bit of infrastructure for most levees. We also have a number of backflow prevention devices. That's just an example I've shown there, but there's a number of different types, different manufacturers and different uses and different conditions. But basically we put those backflow prevention devices on existing stormwater outfalls, again to prevent the river from backing up through our stormwater network and flooding the interior side of the levee. Very similar to what's been put out there for the North Rocky scheme. So again, if you took a walk down Lakes Creek Road, you'd see a number of these that have been installed as part of that scheme. So that's just a quick snapshot. It doesn't show all the technical jargon, it's just something fairly simple to see how the levee's laid out in terms of configuration. So again, you can see north up this way. So if we just work our way, so we connect in up at the new Jellicoe Street intersection, on Lower Dawson Road as part of the Yeppan North project. They've raised that area there, so there's a connection of the levee there. Floodgate over the North Coast rail line, and then we work our way down. Again, this is the key flow path through here, and also obviously down the main river. So we're tied along this area here, incorporate a couple of gates in this area as well to facilitate normal road access. There's a pump station located in proximity to the Hastings site where we're collecting stormwater from this portion of the catchment. We then turn out around Fitters Street, so this is currently Fitters Street along here. We have an emergency spillway, again we'll talk what that all means in this location here, and a pump station. That's actually our biggest pump station of the three in the Fitters Street area. We're then out through Roselle Park, protecting most of the sewage treatment plant around the corner here. Again, we have a number of floodgates. We have then a pump station on the main drain. Again, we'll go through that. Most be familiar with the main drain system, but we're pumping from there. And you can see we do transition to a crib wall system. So we're going that retaining wall system, due to space around the corner here, and then we do transition back to earth, and then ultimately we do go to our composite levee through that Wharf Street area where we get tight for space, back to earth, and then ultimately then the fully demountable system through the main CBD area to ensure that there's no visual impacts. So in terms of just a summary of the configuration, we'll put again a bit of the technical behind this, but that just gives a quick snapshot of the different elements. We'll talk shortly about design immunity of the levee and what that means, and freeboard, but at this stage it's a 1% annual exceedance probability design criteria for the levee system, which is equivalent to 9.6 on the gauge for those familiar with gauge datum. That incorporates then a 0.9 metre freeboard, which is quite significant, probably one of the largest that any Queensland levee has got on it at the moment, and we'll explain why. Working through, we then have a number of levee types, so you can see the breakdown of the levee types that we just discussed before. Ultimately, earth levee is used predominantly, 5.6 kilometres. It's the cheapest, it's the most effective, and we use that wherever we can. We do have transitions in between levee types, and that's really important. It's a key consideration from a technical perspective about how you transition from one levee type to the other. In history and time gone by, they can be weak points, and so there's a lot of guidance around design of those transitions. In terms of interior drainage management, again, we'll talk a bit more about this, but we have 2 detention basins, one at Fitter Street, one at Hastings, 3 pump stations. So again, trying to put that in perspective, you can see the discharges, duty discharges there. So, think of a 1 litre milk container. We're talking 9,000 of those a second at Fitter Street. We're talking 1,000 at Hastings, and then 3,000 litres a second at the main drain. Culverts, we obviously have culverts to allow flow, so where the river isn't up and we just have a local storm event, we want that runoff to get through the levee system, and so we have a number of culverts, 13, that allow the flow through the levee in normal operation, and each of those have backflow prevention to prevent the river from backing up through those culverts. We do have some complementary works or associated works for Lucia Street and Wharf Street, both stormwater drainage upgrades to actually facilitate interior drainage behind the levee and get that water to the main drain to then be pumped out. There's obviously a number of existing services, which I won't go through all those in detail now, but there's a number of protection and treatment requirements for those services like power, gas, electrical. And then we have our emergency spillway. So it's a 400 metre long spillway at Fitter Street. Again, we'll talk in a bit more detail about that. So that's me for now. I'll hand over to Rob and I'll let him cover the geotech considerations.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to give a relatively brief overview of the geotech conditions, especially after that first start. As you can see here, the ground conditions along the alignment are alluvial, and alluvial are flood-borne deposits, usually comprising of sands and clays. This is borne out by the findings of the investigations that have been undertaken. So between the lower Dawson Road to Fitter Street, you can see there's what's been identified to date has been a thin stratum of surface clay underlain by clay gravels and sands. Generally that alignment, based on the embankment arrangements, is definitely suitable for carrying the loads of the embankment, and with expected moderate seepage to occur primarily beneath the clay capping. Whereas for Fitter Street to Fitzroy Bridge, there's a thicker up 6 metre stiff clay underlain by clay and silty sands, also suitable to accommodate the levee structure, but however, because of the thicker clay deposits, less seepage potential. It's worth noting that there are some soft to firm clay layers at depth, and there will be a little bit of consolidation of some of the embankments, which has been accounted for in the design. Soft consolidating soils basically have the ability to basically reduce in size due to the loads placed, due to groundwater being squeezed out of the soil structure. I'll just flip on to what some of the ground investigations were undertaken. There are 3 ground investigations that have been undertaken. The council were extremely proactive in undertaking the first investigation before the commencement of the design, which basically followed the alignment of the original, the first option alignment. That was very helpful in determining additional works and investigations which were staged thereafter, which comprised geophysics and then borehole probes, test pits and cone penetrometer testing. To supplement that, in situ testing to determine expected permeability, i.e. the rate groundwater seepage is going to travel through the soil, was undertaken in the field to give us more accurate representation of the ground models. As part of those investigations, we were asked to evaluate material sources. Embankments are built in particular from soil, and finding a source that would meet the expected 400,000 cubic metres of soil required to build the levee were required, and therefore the Gracemere site was looked at after reviewing some other alternatives. The Gracemere site was found to provide suitable material for our embankments, which is comprised of a core centre with more permeable material on the outer flanks. Some treatment would be required, but the proximity and location seemed to provide value to the project. As part of the design, we go through and I'll just go through with the embankments, we look at stability and we look at seepage. The picture on the left-hand side is a steady state seepage analysis, and this is when all the ground embankment becomes saturated, and basically the contours that can be seen there from red going down to blue is the pressures and the velocities of the groundwater going, or the flood water passing through the levee and down below the levee. And as you can see, the pressures dissipate with time and generally get caught by the trenches and drainage system on the dry side.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you explain, I'm interested in what you're talking about, but could you explain the groundwater situation? I have one of the things about the groundwater, I just couldn't understand how, like with the groundwater that comes to Rockhampton, how is that going to affect or stop affect? I just can't understand what you're talking about. I understand the groundwater, I understand the rest of it. How could you relate that to Rockhampton?
Could we just keep your question to the side, because we have a question and answer period back, so I'll just finish the presentation. If we could just write down that question, please.
There will be opportunity in your bags. There's an SMS number as well. It's just we're really conscious of time.
Yeah. But we'll definitely try to give you an answer during the next stage. So basically, after assessing the seepage potential, the flow paths, that's what goes into determining pumps, how to collect the water, and how the hydraulics is managed. Stability is another aspect of the embankment to ensure that during what's called a rapid drawdown state, which is usually the most critical state for an embankment, a soil embankment, is when it's saturated and water's up against the side on the leeward side or the wet side of the levee. When that water while it's at its maximum height actually provides stabilising force. And what occurs is when the flood levee drops away, the embankment's fully saturated, and then it becomes more likely to be susceptible to instability. And the stability ensures the long-term performance and behaviour of the embankment, and is also carried out to confirm compliance with all those specifications. So from all that information, that feeds into the other design teams that evaluate the hydraulics, the requirement for pumps. So I'll pass over to my colleague Brian to discuss the other civil structures associated with the project.
Just a quick note that during questions we're certainly more than happy to put the slides back up if people have got a specific question about the slides. So feel free to do so. Just in terms of the civil and structural design, as Rob mentioned, we gather a whole lot of information from the geotech side, from the hydrology and the hydraulics, and we obviously develop the engineered components of the levee system. There's certainly some LiDAR data was originally, and then specific site survey along the route was undertaken. We developed our type cross sections, and as Ben mentioned before, there's basically three types. There's an earth levee, a crib wall, and vertical levees, or vertical walls. We looked at property access arrangements, including turnaround areas, some gates, access roads, etc. And we then obviously did the structural design of the gates, which is basically either concrete or steel structural designs. Just as an indication, the average height is about 2.8 metres, the levee, but it does vary from about 0.3 up to about 5.8 metres high. And obviously at the end of all that, we ended up with producing some detailed design drawings and the documentation that goes with that. Oops. A bit fast on the fingers. So I won't go into too much detail other than to show that there's basically three, I think, different types of earth levees. There's two on this side and another slide. There's the vertical temporary, I'll get my buzzer. Whoops, sorry. Going the wrong way. There we go. Get fat fingers out of the rat. And now I can't get the light to work. There it is. So the crest width for the earth levee, it's got a crest width of 4 metres, and effectively that is for access, but it also there's widened areas for turnarounds and for passing. It comprises a clay core zone, and then a sandy clay zone on the outside, and this is around, I guess, optimisation of materials, but more importantly, the stability of the structure. It's got seepage pits at the ends here that you can see, so that relieves the poor pressure from the water. The different type sections are basically to suit the different ground conditions. Going back to what I was saying before, so this is the temporary levee that Ben mentioned before. So there's basically a footing in the ground, and the temporary levee is erected as we go. And this is the composite levee, which has got a footing and an extension, concrete extension above ground, and then the temporary levee goes up above that. And that's because the height of that is too high for a temporary levee alone. And I guess the other one is just to mention that in this top one there is some rock protection on some areas of the outer embankment where the flood velocities are higher, that needs to protect the levee. And then again, this is the composite levee down here. Sorry, that wasn't the composite, that was the crib wall. I just want to mention also about visual amenity very quickly, and that's that it's a very high-level study assessment. It's looking at greening areas. I'm getting a nod to say we've got to keep moving quickly. So I guess there's some further work to be done in terms of that visual amenity. And I'll hand back over to Ben quickly.
Thanks, Brian. All right, we're getting pressed for time, so what I'll do is I'll flick through some slides here and we'll put them up when it comes to the Q&A, because I'm sure you're all going to ask questions that we'll probably have some information more for, hopefully. Environment and heritage protection, I won't cover this in detail, more just to say it's been assessed in terms of planning approvals and cultural heritage requirements, and there's some information on the screen there which you can probably see, and again that's all the reports are on Council's website around the environment assessments. Right, drainage and hydraulics. So probably a key question for a lot of people and a key area to discuss. I'm going to try and be quick and again come back to this and show more information if you need. Firstly, interior versus exterior flooding. There's two separate issues here with levees, and the bottom hopefully shows that. So when we have exterior flooding, we're talking the Fitzroy River. When we're talking interior, we're talking the South Rockhampton local catchment, which can flood as well behind the levee. I won't go through this. Most are aware, Fitzroy River catchment, 142,000 square kilometres, second biggest catchment to the east coast of Australia, and large flows. That's probably the only other thing. So 16,000 cumex. Or greater. That bottom left probably just gives you a quick snapshot. That's our flows for the previous notable flood events. You can see 1918s there, big flows, 18,000 cubic metres a second at the peak. And you can see there's a number of other events there alongside, including our recent 2017 event. In terms of the flood behaviour, when we get flows greater than about 7,500 cubic metres a second down the river, we get the western breakout that occurs, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. So how do we look at a catchment the size of the Fitzroy? So in this case, we're fairly lucky. We've got over 100 years of gauge data upstream of Rocky at Yamba, Wattlebank and the Gap. And so we combine those records and we can look at flood peaks and volumes. Every flood's different, everyone's aware of that, but we can do statistical analysis of all those records to work out a best fit probability distribution, which you can see on the right, and that allows us to estimate flood frequency quantiles, which are flows basically for different probability events. Then we turn to the hydraulics, so we have an indication of how much flow is coming down the river for different annual exceedance probabilities, and so then the hydraulic model then turns those flows into flood behaviour and what height, what extent, what level, what velocity would that water get to around the floodplain. In this case, it's a two-dimensional two-flow model developed for the river. To cut off those questions before you ask, no, this model isn't used for flood forecasting. So if the flood forecasting in the last event was a little bit out, that's not this model. That's a model that BOM runs, which takes a couple of hours, if that. This model here runs for about 4 days, 3 to 4 days. So it's a much more detailed model that's required for the floodplain. Model covers 440 square kilometres of floodplain, 700,000 grid cells to assess flooding, and then when we produce these models, we calibrate them to actual recorded flood heights, recorded velocities, and we make sure that the model can replicate conditions that occur during those flood events. Out of all the studies that we've been involved in, this Fitzroy River is probably the most extensively studied. So there's a number of models that show good correlation between them. There's a couple of animations here. So you're seeing side by side basically. We'll replay it if we have to, or we'll do that during the Q&A. So it's just a side-by-side simulation of a 9.6 gauge height, which is the design height of the levee. And so critically, you can see the levee on the right here in yellow. And yeah, if I go back, see if I can get it to run again. So initially, everyone's aware, and you saw this recently, is you have that backwater come back up Cavill Creek and into the western floodplain. Those coming across the floodplain probably saw dirty water here, clean water on the other side in the last flood. That occurs initially, and then the breakout occurs at the west, up at Pink Lily, and that flows then come back through the Epping crossing. So flows particularly through here, as I said earlier, are critical in terms of the levee, because the levee has to take that flow around the corner there. I'll just go one more time. The other critical flow path is obviously then down the main river channel. And so the levee along here, we've positioned it on the top bank away from the bank as far as we practically can to get it away from constricting the river. There is some slight constriction though that occurs down, particularly around the treatment plant near Gavial Creek there. And that does result in some increase in heights, particularly for this North Rocky area. And that was a key reason why the North Rocky scheme, the other project, was brought forward, was to try and offset the impacts that the South Rocky levee would create. So we'll play this again in Q&A if we need to. I won't go through that. That's the peak flood depths for the 1% or 9.6 gauge height with the levee in place. And you've all seen this, I'm sure. Afflux map, so predicted differences with the levee being put in place. What would occur? What happens to the flooding? So the area in green is obviously protected area. That's no longer wet. And so again, you can see that the key flow path being through the Yeppoon North throat, and also to some lesser extent through the Yeppoon South area. That area there where the levee comes out does cause increases in flood heights, which you can see there, and transitions back to back to the airport. So where you're seeing yellow is basically where we're predicting no change in flood behaviour or height as a result of the levee. So basically once you get to around the airport, you're back to existing conditions prior to the levee. But in these areas here, you can see the colour coding here, there's increases in heights. Most substantial increases is right upstream of this jut out around Hastings. Increases in flood heights there of about 300 mils, keeping in mind that's in the lagoon area where flooding is already about 3 to 4 metres in depth. So it's adding another 300 mils on top of that in that area. North Rocky, again, you can see there's slight increases in flooding, but again, the North Rocky scheme, Dowling Street levee and North Rocky scheme offsets that to a large extent. More zoomed in with some arrows. So you can see again it backs up into this area first, back up through the crossing, and shortly you'll see the turns around and we get the flow around Hastings and down the river obviously. So again, we'll come back to these if they're a bit more zoomed in to show the flood behaviour before and after the levee. So south. So the South Rocky local catchment obviously is in behind the levee. So 10.8 square kilometres, fairly reasonable sized catchment. It's mostly urbanised. Shorter critical duration, so 2 to 9 hours roughly storm duration will cause flooding in this particular catchment. It's fairly ageing infrastructure, as you're aware, so older development and lesser stormwater infrastructure, and has had a number of recent floods. The most recent, lesser extent in 2017, particularly 2008. There was a significant flood event in South Rocky local catchment. 2013, the Australia Day event, and also Marsha in 2015 to some extent. So how do we look at this? So again, we develop a model. It's common practice for the engineering industry to develop a numerical model to assess flood behaviour. Again, it's a similar process, determine flows, simulate actual known events, and make sure that the model can replicate those conditions. And then we simulate with and without the levee conditions. What that all shows is that, and most people are aware who live in Rockhampton, there's a significant catchment in behind the levee, and that stormwater arriving at the levee. Most of the time we see sunny day floods in Rocky, and we have for a number of floods, but 2008 is a good example where we had minor river levels up, but we also had a local rain event occur over the South Rocky catchment. And that for a levee is where we would need to capture some of that stormwater and pump it over the levee. Through the assessment, what we've concluded is that we need 3 pump stations, as I said earlier, 13 culvert penetrations through the system with backflow prevention devices and stormwater diversion works to complement the levee operations. Again, this is just an extract from the model showing flood behaviour. So there's already existing flood risk that most people are aware, that the main flow path comes down through the urban areas into the main drain system, and the main drain comes down to the river. There's already existing issues here and also upstream of the rail. So the rail is a key control, and it's actually subject of a current study that's being undertaken to look at flood mitigation for the local catchment through this area. The levee system, the whole intent is to try and make sure we don't make that any worse and to try and still capture those flows down at particularly Fitter Street. So you can see there's significant storage that occurs down at the Fitter Street sort of lagoon areas. And so that's where our major pump station sits to collect that water and pump it over. Pumping also on the main drain and like I said, down at Hastings. So that's the flood depths for the local catchment with the levee in. And this is our assessment of the implications of what the levee does if you do get that concurrent flooding. So what we've tried to do is maximise, obviously cost with pumping goes up as you choose greater and greater pumps. So we've tried to do an offset, so we've got pumping here and down here. And so we've tried to optimise that pumping rate to ensure that any impacts that do occur here, which you can see in the pink and red, is within areas that aren't populated, so they're within open areas and not affecting existing buildings or floor heights. Keeping in mind again, and it needs to be very clear, is that that's up to the 1% design event. Now there may still be an event that occurs greater than that, and everyone needs to be aware of that. That's a risk with a levee, that you have an interior rainfall event that exceeds the 1%, and there would be some impacts interior to the levee system. I will scoot through this very quickly. So risk management, it's inherent in everything we do in terms of engineering. And so there's a risk register being developed for this project in accordance with the Levee, International Levee Handbook. Operations and maintenance. So we've got an O&M manual, so operations and maintenance manual that we've produced, and an emergency response plan for the project. This project it's a major project, so it will require annual maintenance, routine condition assessments, inspections, and the like throughout its life. Current estimate is $100,000 per annum, made up of maintenance costs and operational costs for the project. Most will probably have seen the cost estimate. So there's a few assumptions there. Again, we can flick back to this in the Q&A around what the assumptions are around the estimate. But that's the breakdown. So about 50, just a touch over 50 million in terms of raw construction costs, with principals, obligations and contingency another 9 and a bit. So total project of 60 million. The economics. So the economics is obviously important as well in terms of justifying whether the project should proceed. When we look at the economics for any flood mitigation project, we have direct benefits and indirect benefits. So direct are like, you can think of those as your reduction in flood damages that occur because the levee's in place. We're offsetting the need to invest in Lower Dawson Road immunity upgrade. So there's about $40 million project there to upgrade Lower Dawson Road eventually. And then there's other indirect benefits, like reduction in insurance premiums that may occur inside the levied area, and also reduce business interruptions and the like with the levee. On the flip side then, there's direct costs, so that's the upfront capital expenditure and then the ongoing operations and maintenance costs. And we pull all that into an economic model and we assess that against a number of sensitivities, which is in accordance with federal requirements for funding applications. And in this particular case, the average benefit cost ratio for the project was 1.6. And it's never dropped below 1 for all the sensitivities that we assessed, and got up to, I think, about 2.5 or so in a best case sensitivity. But in general, around that 1.6, suggesting that the project is the benefits are greater than the costs, basically. First year rate of return is higher than the cash discount rate, which is important from an economics perspective, because that means that the project should proceed immediately if you can, under its current appraisal. So as a quick summary, again, the project was led by one of our US practice leads, Jim Niehoff. He was here throughout the project. As it's a process of ourselves to do constructability reviews, safety and design reviews, and in this case, Council also engaged independent consultant Oricon to do independent reviews of all the work that we were carrying out. And the technical outputs are there, and they're on the website. So again, it's not a small bit of work, as you can probably understand. There's a significant amount of outputs and technical reports and the like that gets produced, and that's sort of a quick snapshot. The other complementary works, and these are important because we have recommended these to Council as well. Pink Lily Meander, it's still ongoing erosion at the Pink Lily Meander, getting closer to the road every flood. And so stabilisation of the meander is important and needs to occur, whether that's through Council, TMR or whoever. And that's also priority 3 in the 92 study as well. Stabilisation of the riverbank between Wood Street and the Bend. Currently there's an unprotected section of bank there where the levee will be adjacent. That's recommended that Council do that works prior to or just after the levee project. Probably the key thing is if the project proceeds, Council needs to be very clear with residual flood risk. So we don't want to see people developing and intensifying development in behind levees. It's not a good outcome. So development controls and making sure the community understands their flood risk after the levee is paramount. So our technical findings after the project was complete, it's technically viable and would significantly reduce flood risk for the interior area. The project will impact on some private lands and require resumptions or easements. That's important to note. It will have some impacts to flood behaviour, which we've documented in our reports. Economic evaluation shows that the project is positive in terms of BCR. And importantly, any levee or any major infrastructure requires careful construction and then operation and maintenance to ensure that it actually performs its intended function. And so that's an important recommendation. Right, that's me.
Okay, just before I start, I just want to ensure everyone that we will allocate a full 30 minutes for question time, and I'm conscious of time at the moment, so I will be as quick and brief as I can. Some of this has already been just covered by Ben, so I'm going to go through these quite quickly, but there is clearly residential benefits. There's 1,500 dwellings identified as within the flood zone. There's the regular clean-up costs and damage costs that should be included. There is a potential for reduction in insurance premiums. The final alignment, as it's been designed, protects key infrastructure, and it's critical now with that Yeppen crossing being completed that really does put a focus on Gladstone Road, because once Gladstone Road is protected, suddenly we have the national highways protected. So that is a very significant piece of infrastructure to be considered. I also have mentioned on that slide South Rockhampton treatment plant and also a number of existing schools. So there is some key infrastructure that is protected by this levee. Right now, Council's current commitment. I mentioned earlier we have a floodplain management strategy that's adopted. Council spends on average around $3 million a year to effectively undertake studies and design flood mitigation works. The studies and the works are funded from our general revenue. Where we are right now, Council's draft 2017-18 budget has allocated $10 million over 3 years to fund its share of the South Rockhampton flood levee. The next steps, this was mentioned briefly by Ben. The project has been fully designed in an engineering sense. There are some other steps to go forward. Planning approval is required, and that involves effectively Council lodging an application and getting environmental approval and planning approval to proceed. And that is another step in the process where in actual fact this project will be exhibited for public comment. There's property acquisitions. There is an early works package. There was lots of talk about utilities, stormwater, and the need for backflow. So there is an opportunity to start works on that early works, which is effectively works we control ourselves. And then the final step is the construction of a levee, and that would be done as a major contract and through a tender process. Thank you very much.